Most of what you've been told about empaths is a flat-out lie. You've been trained to view them as fragile. You see them as the hypersensitive, bleeding hearts of the room, vulnerable targets waiting to be picked apart by predators. But today, we are pulling back the curtain on a psychological phenomenon that is currently unfolding in plain sight, one that most people are completely blind to. If you look closely at the room you're in right now, you aren't just looking at people. You are looking at survival scripts. Every single person is running a subconscious program designed to keep them safe, to seek validation, or to hide their deepest vulnerabilities. For decades, the empath script was simple: absorb, appease, and endure. They were the shock absorbers of other people's toxic, unmanaged emotions. But a massive systemic shift is occurring. Carl Jung spoke of the confrontation with the shadow, the moment a human being stops running from their darkest, most suppressed parts and integrates them. When an empath undergoes this integration, their entire behavioral matrix rewrites itself. They stop absorbing the room and they start commanding it. They transition from prey to the most psychologically formidable force in any environment. Most people don't believe this rise is possible. They assume the empath is permanently broken by their past. They expect the old, compliant script to run forever. But they are failing to read the signals. They are missing the quiet shift in posture, the steadying of the vocal tone, and the absolute absence of micro-compliance. If you choose to walk away from this talk right now, you will remain blind to the invisible power dynamics operating in your relationships, your workplace, and your own mind. You will continue to mistake quiet observation for weakness, and you will inevitably be blindsided when the power in the room shifts. But if you stay, if you pay close attention to the behavior patterns we are about to decode, you will learn exactly how a healed empath unlocks an internal authority that no one saw coming. Watch this to the very end, because once you see these psychological triggers in action, you can never unsee them. Look around you. Every person you meet is playing a game of chess, but most of them don't even know they're holding the pieces. They are running on instinct, reacting to invisible triggers, and desperate for safety. For the longest time, the world looked at the highly sensitive person, the empath, and saw a pawn. They saw someone who could be manipulated, someone whose deep capacity for feeling made them easy to read and even easier to exploit. But there is a quiet revolution happening in the deeper layers of human psychology. Carl Jung once wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. What happens when the person who has felt everyone else's darkness finally decides to look at their own? They change the game entirely. Today, we are decoding the rise of the integrated empath, the awakening that no one believed they had inside them, but one that is absolutely inevitable once the psychological puzzle pieces click into place. To understand the rise, we have to understand the starting point. The untrained empath is a walking, breathing radar system. Their brain is constantly scanning for threats, micro-expressions, and shifts in vocal tone. Why? Because early in life they learned that survival meant keeping everyone else calm. They ran what we call the appease script. If someone else was angry, they absorbed it. If someone else was anxious, they carried it. They wore their empathy like a wound, hoping that if they were kind enough, soft enough, and compliant enough, the world would treat them gently. But the world doesn't work that way. Human nature preyed on that softness. The takers, the narcissists, and the manipulators saw a resource to be drained. And they believed, foolishly, that this was the empath's permanent state. They made the fatal mistake of confusing a survival mechanism for a core identity. This is where Carl Jung changes everything. Jung knew that a person who is only good is incomplete, fragile, and ultimately dangerous to themselves. He introduced us to the shadow, the dark, unaccepted, and powerful parts of our psyche that we push into the basement of our minds. For the empath, the shadow contains their boundaries. It contains their capacity to say no, their healthy aggression, their anger, and their power. The rise of the empath begins the moment they stop fearing their own darkness. When they realize that being good is not the same as being harmless. A harmless person cannot choose to be good. They are simply weak. But an integrated person, someone who has faced their shadow, has the capacity to cause damage, yet chooses peace. When an empath integrates their shadow, they stop trying to keep the peace. They start demanding truth. They stop running the social scripts of micro-compliance. They look you in the eyes, and they do not flinch. Normally, when an empath enters a room, they act like a thermometer. They read the temperature of the room and adjust themselves to match it. If the room is tense, they become tense. But the healed empath becomes a thermostat. They no longer absorb the anxiety, the ego, or the toxicity of the people around them. Instead, they project an internal state of absolute, unshakable certainty. Because they have faced their own internal storms, your external storm no longer moves them. When a manipulator tries to run an old script of guilt or shame on an integrated empath, it doesn't just fail, it bounces back. The empath sees the behavior, decodes the underlying insecurity in real time, and simply refuses to play. They see your suffering long before they see your mask, and that makes them incredibly dangerous to anyone trying to play a dishonest game. This rise doesn't look like a loud, theatrical explosion. It doesn't look like someone standing on a desk shouting for respect. That is the behavior of the insecure. The rise of the empath is quiet, cold, and utterly devastating to those who used to control them. It is found in the pause before they speak. It is found in the steady, unblinking gaze that says, "I see exactly what you are doing, and it has no power here." It is found in the absolute, quiet boundary that cannot be negotiated. No one believed they had this inside them because they were so used to the empath bending. But when a piece of steel is bent far enough, it doesn't stay bent. It builds up massive potential energy. And when it snaps back, it does so with terrifying force. The rise is here. The scripts have changed. And the world is about to realize that the most dangerous person in the room is the one who used to feel everything, but now fears nothing. The transition from a wounded empath to a healed, integrated individual begins with an act of profound behavioral rebellion, the systematic execution and death of the automatic, subconscious social scripts of appeasement and micro-compliance. To understand why this shift is so cataclysmic, we must first decode what these scripts actually look like in real-time human interaction. From a behavioral profiling perspective, a wounded empath does not operate on conscious choice. They operate on survival programming. This programming manifests as 1,000 tiny daily concessions, micro-compliances, that signal to the surrounding environment that the empath's boundaries are fluid, negotiable, or entirely non-existent. It is the reflexive apology when someone bumps into them. It is the immediate nervous smile meant to diffuse a stranger's minor irritation. It is the slight tilting of the head, the lowering of the vocal pitch, and the subtle collapsing of physical posture designed to project harmlessness. The subconscious mind of the untrained empath believes that if they can successfully signal absolute submission and utility to the people around them, they will be granted safety. They become hyper-vigilant radar systems, scanning the room for any ripple of tension, anger, or discomfort, and immediately modifying their own behavioral output to neutralize that tension. They act as human shock absorbers, neutralizing the emotional toxicity of others at the expense of their own psychological sovereignty. This automatic reaction is what predators, manipulators, and narcissists look for. They spot these behavioral tells instantly. They see the micro-compliances as a green light, an invitation to exploit a resource that will actively assist in its own exploitation. The death of this script is not a gradual fading, it is a deliberate, conscious shutdown of the machine. When an empath begins their rise, the very first thing that disappears is this automatic compliance. They stop filling the uncomfortable silences in conversation just to make the other person feel at ease. They stop nodding along with statements they do not agree with, simply to avoid a minor social friction. This shift registers instantly in their physical presentation. The nervous, placating micro-expressions vanish, replaced by a neutral, unblinking stillness. When a manipulator attempts to pull the usual behavioral levers, using a sharp tone, a sudden silence, or a subtle guilt trip, the healed empath does not rush forward to fix it. They sit in the discomfort. By refusing to run the appeasement script, they effectively cut the energetic supply line that the manipulator relies on. This structural collapse of the old behavioral matrix forces a massive power asymmetry in every relationship they hold. The people who were accustomed to the empath's immediate capitulation suddenly find themselves hitting a wall of absolute, silent friction. The empath is no longer managing the emotional temperature of the room for the comfort of others. They are managing their own internal state with ruthless efficiency. They recognize that the urge to appease is merely a symptom of unhealed trauma, a ghost in the psychological machinery that mistakes social harmony for actual survival. By letting that script die, they strip away the camouflage that kept them hidden in plain sight as prey. They accept the social friction. They accept the disapproval of those who can no longer use them, and they step into a cold, clinical awareness of how human dynamics actually operate. The integration of the shadow is not an invitation to become cruel, malicious, or destructive. Rather, it is the deliberate, calculated reclamation of an individual's suppressed capacity for aggression, absolute boundaries, and unvarnished truth. For the empath, the shadow is rarely populated by monstrous impulses or hidden malice. Instead, it is where they have buried their teeth. Early in life, the empath's environment conditioned them to believe that their sensitivity was their only acceptable trait, forcing them to split their psyche in two. They banished their anger, their resentment, their capacity to defend themselves, and their natural survival instincts into the dark basement of the unconscious mind, erroneously labeling these vital forces as dangerous or bad. By doing so, they rendered themselves psychologically toothless, mistaking a total lack of defense mechanisms for genuine moral virtue. Carl Jung recognized that a person who is incapable of causing harm is not virtuous. They are simply helpless, and a helpless person is entirely at the mercy of their environment. The true rise of the empath begins the moment they cease this self-inflicted exile and actively descend into their own darkness to retrieve those buried psychological weapons. When an empath integrates their shadow, they are transforming their vulnerability into psychological steel by accepting that anger is not an enemy to be suppressed, but information and fuel. They recognize that healthy aggression is the exact mechanism required to construct a boundary that cannot be crossed. This internal alchemy changes their entire behavioral signature. In human interaction, dominance and submission are communicated almost entirely through subperceptual signals, micro-movements, vocal resonance, and spatial awareness. A person who has not integrated their shadow projects a subtle vibe of exploitability. Their energy screams that they will tolerate mistreatment to preserve a superficial connection. The moment the shadow is integrated, that vibe vanishes completely. The healed empath no longer seeks to avoid conflict at all costs, because they are no longer terrified of their own capacity to handle it. They bring their dark side to the negotiating table, using it not to attack, but to anchor themselves. This manifests behaviorally as an icy, unshakable calm. When confronted with manipulation, deceit, or disrespect, the integrated empath does not react with emotional volatility or defensive pleading. Instead, they deliver the absolute truth with the cold, clinical precision of a scalpel. They say exactly what is happening in the room, stripping away the social polite fictions that manipulators rely on for cover. This weaponized truth is devastating because it is entirely devoid of emotional desperation. The shadow gives the empath the stomach to walk away from toxic dynamics without looking back, completely immune to the guilt trips, gaslighting, or shaming tactics that used to paralyze them. They accept that they have the capacity to inflict psychological damage by simply holding up a mirror to the manipulator's deceit, and they no longer feel guilty for doing so. By embracing the full spectrum of their humanity, the light and the dark, they eliminate the psychological split that made them fragile. They are no longer a fragmented target waiting to be dismantled. They are a unified, psychologically formidable entity that commands respect, not through loud, performative dominance, but through the terrifying quietness of a soul that has faced its own worst fears and come back whole. The profound transformation from a wounded empath to an integrated force manifests most visibly as a dramatic operational inversion, the shift from emotional absorption to psychological command. In their unhealed state, the empath's primary systemic flaw is that they operate like an open, energetic conduit, a vulnerable sponge that automatically drinks in the ambient anxiety, hidden hostility, and chaotic emotional waste of whatever environment they occupy. This passive absorption is not an intentional choice. When an unhealed empath walks into a high-tension boardroom, a fractured family gathering, or a room filled with passive-aggressive subtext, their internal baseline immediately matches the external chaos. They take on the frantic pacing, the shallow breathing, and the knots of anxiety belonging to the people around them, entirely losing their own center in the process. They allow the external world to dictate their internal state, rendering them perpetually exhausted, easily manipulated, and structurally unstable. The healed empath, however, breaks this loop by intentionally switching their role from a passive thermometer that merely reflects the temperature to an active thermostat that dictates it. This shift in command is achieved through the development of absolute internal certainty, a psychological anchoring so dense that it exerts a gravity of its own. When an individual possesses total clarity about who they are, what they see, and what they will tolerate, their internal reality becomes significantly heavier and more stable than the fragmented, chaotic realities of those around them. In behavioral mechanics, the person with the highest level of certainty always dominates the emotional field of a room. When the integrated empath enters a toxic or highly charged environment, they no longer allow the room's anxiety to penetrate their psychological skin. Instead, they project an unshakable, calm authority that forces the room to calibrate to them. This command is not executed through loud, aggressive assertions of power or performative social posturing, which are always the hallmarks of underlying insecurity. Rather, it is executed through a clinical, detached presence. When others vent their unmanaged emotions, throw tantrums, or attempt to project their internal shame, the integrated empath remains entirely unmoved, observing the behavior with the detached curiosity of a scientist watching a chemical reaction. They anchor their posture, slow down their breathing, and drop the tempo of their speech. This unexpected refusal to absorb the emotional energy creates a massive psychological vacuum. The manipulator or anxious individual, expecting their emotional currency to be accepted and processed by the empath, suddenly finds no takers. The toxic energy has nowhere to land, forcing the instigator to either escalate to the point of exposing their own absurdity or, more commonly, to subconsciously down-regulate their own behavior to match the empath's icy composure. By altering the emotional climate through sheer internal resistance, the healed empath takes complete control of the interpersonal space, establishing an environment where deception and emotional manipulation simply cannot breathe. They become the unshakable center of gravity around which everyone else is forced to orbit. The rise of the integrated empath is a phenomenon that completely evades the radar of the average observer because it relies on a structural mechanics of influence that is entirely silent, covert, and devoid of performative display. In a culture that conditions people to associate power with volume, aggression, and overt dominance behavior, the quiet recalibration of a healed empath is almost completely invisible until the exact moment the power dynamic has already shifted beyond repair. Most people are trained to look for obvious status signals: the expansive posture, the loud interruptions, the desperate scramble for the head of the table, or the aggressive assertion of credentials. The healed empath, having decoded human behavior at a subterranean level, recognizes these loud displays for what they truly are: overcompensations for an underlying terror of being exposed or controlled. Consequently, the empath's rise does not mimic this loud, fragile hierarchy. Instead, it manifests as an unshakable, quiet behavioral authority that operates beneath the conscious awareness of the room. This silent rise is engineered through the precise mastery of micro-behaviors, situational control, and tactical stillness. When an integrated empath enters a space, their presence is felt not by what they do, but by what they completely refuse to do. They do not engage in the subtle, anxious signaling that 99% of the population uses to buy social comfort. They do not laugh nervously at jokes that are not funny. They do not break eye contact first during a high-stakes confrontation. They do not adjust their physical position to accommodate someone else's aggressive entry into their personal space. This complete absence of micro-submission creates an immediate, unexplained friction in the subconscious minds of those around them. To a trained behaviorist, their stillness is louder than a shout. It signals an individual who has zero dependency on external validation and who cannot be intimidated by social pressure. When a manipulator or a dominant personality attempts to use traditional psychological leverage, such as long, calculated silences, sharp tonal drops, or subtle pacing shifts, the healed empath simply watches them, entirely unaffected. They use the power of the absolute pause, allowing the other person's manipulative tactics to hang in the air until the instigator becomes suffocated by their own behavioral choice. This quiet authority is devastating because it leaves the antagonist with absolutely no leverage to grip onto. You cannot push against a wall that does not push back, but simply refuses to move. The empath's rise is built on the reality that the person who requires the least from the room holds the ultimate command over it. Because they have achieved total internal alignment through Jungian shadow integration, they no longer need the room to applaud them, fear them, or even understand them. This total freedom from the need for external approval grants them a clinical, detached clarity. They can observe the shifting alliances, the hidden agendas, and the fragile egos playing out in front of them with total objectivity, adjusting their own leverage points in complete silence. By the time the people around them realize that the old rules of manipulation no longer apply, the healed empath has already subtly redrawn the boundaries of the entire environment, establishing a silent dominion based entirely on unshakable internal truth and absolute behavioral autonomy. The ultimate lever of the healed empath, the crowning achievement of their psychological evolution is the transition from being a helpless victim of their own sensitivity to becoming a master behavioral profiler who weaponizes deep perception into an unassailable defensive and strategic asset. In their unhealed past, the empath's capacity to feel the hidden undercurrents of human emotion was a source of constant torment. They were flooded with data they did not know how to categorize, leaving them raw, exposed, and easily controlled. However, once integration occurs, that raw emotional receptor system is upgraded into a highly sophisticated clinical diagnostic instrument. Because the empath has spent a lifetime hyper-attuning to the micro-expressions, vocal inflections, and shifts in energetic posture of the people around them just to survive, they possess an archive of human behavioral data that the average person could never hope to accumulate. When this archive is coupled with the cold clarity of a healed mind, the empath gains the unprecedented ability to decode the hidden motivations, hidden insecurities, and subconscious agendas of others in real time. They see the suffering, the desperation, and the fragile ego driving a manipulator's behavior long before that manipulator even finishes speaking. This deep perception strips away the illusion of power that toxic individuals rely on. To the untrained eye, an aggressive boss or a manipulative partner appears intimidating and powerful. To the healed empath, that same individual looks like a frightened child running a loud, desperate script to avoid being exposed. This total destruction of the antagonist's mystique changes the leverage in any interaction. You cannot successfully manipulate someone who is looking directly at the exact wound you are trying to hide behind your mask. The healed empath uses this profiling capacity not to attack or malevolently exploit, but to build a fortress of absolute psychological protection around themselves and those they choose to shield. They spot the tiny, subtle red flags, the microscopic indicators of deceit, entitlement, or malice, weeks or months before they manifest as overt betrayal. This predictive capacity allows them to quietly steer clear of traps, diffuse manipulative setups before they can be sprung, and selectively disconnect from individuals who pose a threat to their peace. Furthermore, when confrontation is unavoidable, this profiling insight becomes a precision scalpel. Because they understand the precise psychological architecture of the person standing across from them, they know exactly which leverage point to touch to completely collapse an aggressive display. They do not waste energy arguing or matching the volume of a toxic person. Instead, they calmly speak directly to the hidden insecurity driving the attack, exposing the truth with a single, devastatingly accurate observation. This level of influence is terrifying to anyone accustomed to playing dishonest games, because the healed empath effectively removes the smoke and mirrors from the room, forcing everyone into a state of absolute psychological nudity. They become entirely immune to gaslighting, because their internal radar for truth is sharper than any narrative a liar tries to construct.